macro Hive has published its list of grey swans for 2022, highlighting low probability but high impact events that only a few expect to happen. This year's swans include, for example, the US plunging into a recession, the COVID-19 virus disappearing, crypto platforms killing off Facebook, and Elon Musk selling all his Tesla shares to solve world hunger. The global economy could be shaken by a severe La Nina, with extreme weather disrupting supply chains. A collapse of Brazilian real or disintegration of the Eurozone could also be on the cards. And in November, US Democrats might justify the odds and grab a victory for the midterm elections. Well, let's get to Bilal Hafeez, who is the CEO of Macro Hive. Let's just get this right. So we've got black swans, Bilal, which are unpredictable with severe consequences. Grey rhinos with high probability but are neglected. So we're now to grey swans, which is your set of scenarios. Low probability but high impact. Bilal, lovely to see you, my friend, but why should I believe a word you say when your grey swan number 12 is Manchester United wins the Champions League? That clearly isn't going to happen.
Well, that I should actually say that's more like a black swan rather than a grey swan. So I threw that in there. I'm a Liverpool fan, so I had to, have something to mock my fellow Manchester United fans and just remind them they're fall from grace. But that's more like a black swan or black hole swan. And that's very, very unlikely, I think. But we thought we'd put it in there just to keep a certain segment of our audience happy.
All right, look, there's a lot in there, and there's a lot of extraordinary scenarios here. I'm going to say that some of them are a bit cheeky, and you just said them to get a bit of attention. But in terms of these, I think there's several of them. I've got at least 15 in front of me as well. What is the most likely out of these grey swans that you're actually most seriously quite concerned about, or actually think it might be quite a good thing on the opposite side of the coin?
Well, I think the one that there's two I'm focusing on in particular. One is the supply chain grey swan, where we say that all supply chain issues disappear this year. So I think that's an interesting one. You know, already we've seen some recent PMI data that's come out, which shows that some of the delivery times are starting to ease up. And that could be interesting over the course of this year, where we've had such a big focus on supply chains, but maybe this year it starts to go away. And the reason for this is that there's been a lot of adaptation to supply chain issues and inventory building into the end of last year. And at the same time, we could see some softening in demand over the course of this year, which then leads to the whole supply-demand imbalance starting to disappear. So I think that's very much kind of on the cards and may not even be a grey swan for this year. So that's one I'm focusing on. And the other one, which is at this stage not really a base case, but I think still is something we should focus on, is a US recession. And that is based on the fact that whenever the Fed hikes rates, and on top of that, if you do have a steep rise in oil prices, that almost always leads to a recession. Yet at the same time, people aren't really expecting much risk of a recession this year. So those are the two I'm most focused on in terms of the list that we have.
Bilal, both of them indicate a policy mistake, though, and this is a fascinating point in time to bring it up, given that we've had a very huge reaction on markets to the Fed minutes, where we're now looking at 3 rate hikes. If you're saying supply chain could get fixed this year, that could take out some of the pressure on inflation, and if you're also indicating recession, means that we're very wrong on the bond markets, on the curve we're watching. So just walk us through that.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the main issue here is that the Fed has been slow at each point of this cycle so far. So, at the beginning of last year, it was neglecting inflationary pressures and said there was nothing to see here. And now, just as inflation has reached extremely high levels, now it's turned the ship around. This year's interesting that even, the Fed's forecast itself and also consensus, almost everybody's expecting inflation to fall this year rather than continue to rise. And so we have this issue where the Fed is tending to sort of lag developments on the global economy side. And so, we could see that rather than the Fed being behind the curve in terms of taming inflation, it could be behind the curve in terms of dealing with recessionary risks. And I think the issue here is that the Fed, it takes time for the Fed to turn the ship around. So it spent a long time talking about transitory inflation, which turned out not to be correct in terms of its own evaluation of it. And now that it's pivoted and it's doubling down on this, as we saw from the Fed minutes yesterday, it'll be hard for them to turn around, even if inflation starts to fall, and even if growth starts to fall. And so I think this is likely to be the big story for Q1 of this year.
Bilal, if we had 3 wishes from a genie, I think some of us would choose for COVID to disappear. This is number 2 on your list, that COVID all but disappears. How does that happen? What are the chances of that actually occurring?
Yeah, no, obviously, making any predictions on COVID is very, very difficult. But the essence of this argument is that the mutations we're seeing in COVID, the move from Delta to Omicron, does seem to suggest that the fatality risks are much lower. So the risk of hospitalization is lower. So that tells you that, some of the risks, the more extreme risks associated with COVID are starting to wane. At the same time, the infection rates are very high. And so what that means is that if a larger proportion of the population gets infected but doesn't get hospitalized, they build up natural immunity. So even in countries which don't have very large vaccination programs, you will end up having this kind of natural immunity building up, along with vaccination drives that immunizes the rest of the population. And then at the same time, the other side of this, which could see an alleviation of COVID, is if we see further mutations, which then lead to a shift like we saw from Delta to Omicron, where transmission may increase, but then the seriousness decreases and it starts to look much more like a cold or a flu.
Fascinated by many of these, actually, Bilal, and one of them is Crypto Kills Facebook. I'm actually reading the article on your website as well. It's fascinating. Tell us more about that one.
Yeah, so the essence here is that in some ways, if you think sort of philosophically, what Facebook, a company like Facebook does very well is that it gets people to connect to their platform, give up their content and their contacts to Facebook, and then Facebook monetizes all of that value. And in return, what users gain is likes for their posts, but they don't receive a monetary value. Now, what crypto does, in essence, is that it allows the creators of content to receive some value, and that's the sort of the powerful aspect of crypto and things like NFT, where you can exactly trace the owner of a piece of data and then get them to receive some value. And so what we could see is the emergence of the use of blockchain and crypto to track the value of content and networks being built up and share that value to the users and the members of those communities using crypto, which is something that is antagonistic to the Facebook model, which is more about centralization. And so this could be in many ways where people are talking about the risk of big tech and how to deal with it, regulation and so on. I actually think crypto is probably the thing that is the biggest challenge to big tech and the most effective way to contain the power of big tech, where you use crypto and blockchain to decentralize the value chain of the content.
Bilal, I've got to say there's a lot of interesting themes that you're tackling with this report, and one is around climate change and ESG, and I want to get to one of the points that's Grey Swan number 5. La Nina strikes hard, Noah's Ark time. I must admit I've been trying to offload a Noah's Ark at home. I got rid of the Ark, but not Noah at this point. But you're saying it might prove useful because we might move from mild to extreme events.
Yes, absolutely. So there's different types of, weather patterns that we see, the El Nino, La Nina. And what we've seen in recent years is that these sort of shifts in sort of wind patterns from west to east and east to west across the world have been becoming much more extreme. And while this year people aren't expecting an extreme outcome, those forecasts have often been incorrect. And so what this means is that if we do see an extreme La Nina event, what that could mean is a drought in the US. It could see flooding in Southeast Asia. And this is, goes to a broader point around climate change, where we are starting to see more extreme outcomes, whether it's, extensive sort of rainfall, or whether it's tornadoes, or whether it's droughts. And at the same time, an interesting feature of all of this is, and this is something we saw in the US and also in Greece, is that during the pandemic, many people have moved to rural areas, and that actually creates the conditions for more more risk of triggering events of things like forest fires, because if people are now located in, say, forests, there's more likely means for sparks or events to trigger forest fires. And so you have this strange kind of combination of more extreme weather patterns, and at the same time, people moving into areas that can trigger things like forest fires. And so this is certainly something to watch. It's hard, obviously, to forecast things like weather. It's almost as hard as forecasting markets, but this is something that we certainly need to focus on.
And there's a fascinating one about what's going on stateside in November, of course. Dominique Dorfecho looking at that one. I'm not entirely sure at the moment that the polls are saying that the Democrats can actually have a good midterms as well, but it's an outside possibility, is it?
Yeah, I mean, this is the tough one. I mean, the polls are really going against Democrats. And even leaving aside the current administration, historically, we know that the first midterms after a presidential election typically do switch over to the opposition party. But there are some conditions in which we could see the polls shift the other way. You know, one would be that if we were to see COVID disappear, as is one of our Grey Swans, that takes a lot of pressure away from the Biden administration and could show, you know, that there has been some success. The other one is that, you know, we could start to see the effects of some of the big fiscal programs that the Biden administration has implemented, the infrastructure program. People could start to see the benefits of that, which could help the Biden administration. And then the other side is the Republicans could self-destruct as well. You know, we're at the anniversary of the January 6th insurrection. And so there's still lots of issues around the Republican Party and their own image. So there are certain factors we could see unfold in the coming 6 months, which could see a shift towards the Democrats. But I would say this certainly is more of a Grey Swan than a base case.
But now we're going to leave it there. But instead of worrying about Manchester United winning the Champions League, I think you need to worry about giving up 2-0 leads and letting City win the Premiership by the end of February at this rate.
It's been a depressing Christmas as a Liverpool fan.
Well, yeah, I've got a soft spot for them. Don't support them, but got a soft spot for them. But I wish them well. I hope they keep the league alive. Anyway, lovely to hear from you. Happy New Year and a fascinating segment. Thanks, Bilal. Bilal Hafeez, who is the CEO of Macro Hive.